In 1937, Packard outsold Cadillac at the top of the American luxury market. 109,000 cars. The brand that presidents rode in, that Japan's royal family owned 10 of. By 1958, the Packard name was on a rebadged Studebaker. Collectors have a word for those cars. They call them Packard bakers. That gap from the best-selling luxury car in America to a badge-engineered Studebaker happened in 4 years. And it started with one deal, signed without an audit, that handed Packard's last capital to a partner who had hidden just how broken it was. The number that came back from South Bend, Indiana, after that deal closed was 282,000. That was Studebaker's real annual break-even. The number Studebaker had given Packard's negotiators was approximately 120,000. No independent audit had been required before the deal was signed. Packard's chief financial officer came back to Detroit and was, in the president's own words, ashen-faced. This is how America's greatest luxury car died. If you are watching this on your phone right now, tap the like button on the screen. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be told. To understand why Packard died when it did, you have to understand what it was when it was winning. James Ward Packard was a mechanical engineer who bought a Winton automobile in 1898. He found problems with it and told Alexander Winton, who built the car. Winton told Packard that if he knew so much, he should build his own. Packard took that seriously. The first Packard automobile was driven on November 6, 1899, in Warren, Ohio. It had one cylinder, it ran, and Packard and his brother William built 400 more before they moved the operation to Detroit in 1903. There, a railroad investor named Henry B. Joy had bought 2 Packards, been impressed by their reliability, and put his money behind the company. He brought in Albert Kahn and set Packard down on 40 acres of East Grand Boulevard on Detroit's east side. The cars were priced between $2,000 and $7,000, built exclusively for the wealthy. Packard competed directly with Rolls-Royce and Mercedes-Benz, and in the years before the First World War, it was winning. James Ward Packard himself wrote what became the company's defining slogan. When a potential buyer asked for a catalog, Packard replied that if they wanted to know how good the car was, they should ask the man who owned one. The line became a creed that Packard used for 56 years. Packard's rise to the top of the American luxury market did not happen slowly. It happened with an engine. In 1915, Packard introduced the Twin Six, the first production 12-cylinder engine ever put in an American automobile. It was not a refinement of what already existed. It was a statement. Cadillac had an 8, Buick had an 8, Packard had 12, and it was running. The Twin Six gave Packard the machine it needed to compete not with the rest of American industry, but with Rolls-Royce and Mercedes-Benz, and it won. Presidents rode in Packards. Japan's imperial family owned 10 of them by 1931. The car James Ward Packard had built had become the standard for American luxury on a world stage. If your grandfather owned a Packard, you already know what this name carried. Not just a car, an argument about what American craftsmanship could do when no one was cutting corners. A Packard cost $2,000 when most Americans earned $500 a year. The people who could afford one bought it without asking what it cost. That was what the slogan promised. Ask the man who owns one. The answer was always the same. By the 1920s, the East Grand Boulevard plant had grown into something that did not look like a factory. It looked like a city, 3.5 million square feet, 30,000 workers from 80 trades. Albert Kahn designed every building, including the 10th, which became the first industrial structure in the world built entirely from reinforced concrete. a design that changed how every American factory was built after it. The smell of hot lacquer and fresh paint ran through 3 shifts. Impact wrenches kept a rhythm down the line that the workers could set their watches to. One car left that plant every 10 minutes, shift after shift, model year after model year. Then the war came, and Packard became something larger than a luxury car company. In 1940, Rolls-Royce needed a manufacturer who could build the Merlin 5 12 engine at scale, the engine that would power the P-51 Mustang, the Lancaster Bomber, and the Hurricane. Rolls-Royce went to Ford. Ford declined. They went to Chrysler. Chrysler declined. They came to Packard. Packard said yes. Between 1941 and 1945, Packard produced more than 67,000 marine and aircraft engines. Over 50,000 were Merlins. Women worked the line for the first time. The plant ran 24 hours a day. In 1944, Packard's war revenue was $455 million. The car company from Warren, Ohio, had helped win a war. In 1937, there was no one ahead of Packard at the top of the American luxury market. Ask the man who owns one. But someone had already started asking a different question. For almost 20 years after the war, the seeds of Packard's collapse had been growing inside a decision the company made in 1935. Packard had survived the Depression by entering the mid-price market, a car under $1,000 that saved the company but blurred its identity. By 1939, the ratio of economy Packards to senior Packards was 12-1. The brand that had served America's aristocracy had become a mid-range automobile with an aristocratic name. The slogan still said, "Ask the man who owns one." Any man could own one now. Then, Chrysler bought Packard's longtime body supplier in 1952 and gave Packard 2 years before the contract ended. When it did, Packard moved to a cramped plant on Connor Avenue. Cars bearing the Packard name did not go together the way they once had. James J. Nance arrived at Packard as president in 1952 with a plan to save it. Nance had spent his career at General Electric running the Hot Point appliance division. He had never worked in the automobile industry. He believed the only way for an independent automaker to survive was to stop being independent. His plan was to merge Packard with Studebaker and compete as a combined company against GM, Ford, and Chrysler. On October 1st, 1954, Packard purchased Studebaker Corporation in South Bend, Indiana. 1 week later, Nance sent his chief financial officer, Walter Grant, to South Bend to review Studebaker's books. Grant came back to Detroit ashen-faced. The real break-even was 282,000 cars a year. Studebaker had never come close to its own break-even, and it never would. No independent audit had been required before Packard signed. Packard's remaining capital was now obligated to cover a partner whose real financial position had never been disclosed. Here is what I find genuinely difficult about this. The difference between 120,000 and 282,000 is not a rounding error. It is the difference between a difficult merger and an impossible one. Nobody in the room asked for an auditor. On June 25, 1956, the last true Packard rolled off the Connor Avenue assembly line in Detroit. 11,000 workers, machinists, and assemblers, and body fitters and painters, people who had spent entire careers inside the plant Albert Kahn built, were out of a job. Some of them had been there since the war years, since the days when the East Grand Boulevard complex ran 24 hours a day, and women first came to the line because there was no one else. Men who had learned their trades inside those walls, who had built Merlin engines for the P-51 Mustang and come back to build Packards when the war was over. The last shift ended. The plant went quiet on a Tuesday in June. Across the country, Packard dealers had recently been required to sign new franchise agreements for a Clipper line Nance was separating into its own brand. Some had signed just weeks before the shutdown. They had committed to new inventory. They had reorganized their showrooms around a model that was supposed to carry them into the next year. The factory shut that July. Nobody sent a letter to the dealers. Nobody made a phone call. The agreements they had just signed covered a car with no factory behind it. Studebaker Packard's losses in 1956 totaled more than $100 million. Nance tried to sell the combined company to Chrysler. Chrysler said no. He approached Ford. Ford had declined. He went to Curtiss-Wright Corporation, an aerospace company that had wanted Studebaker's defense manufacturing contracts for years. Curtiss-Wright was not interested in building luxury cars. It wanted the engine plant and the production facilities. The deal gave Curtiss-Wright those assets in exchange for a cash infusion and a management agreement. Nance resigned the day the papers were signed and joined Ford Motor Company that fall. But back in the showrooms that summer, a dealer who had just signed a franchise agreement was still sitting with cars under a name that had no factory. Cadillac had faced every pressure Packard had faced. But Cadillac belonged to General Motors, and belonging to GM meant never having to make a survival deal. We did not lose Packard to foreign competition. We did not lose it to a market that stopped caring. We lost it to one merger, signed in October 1954, by a man who had spent his career selling kitchen appliances and did not require an independent audit before he handed over what Packard had left. In 1957 and 1958, cars sold under the Packard name came out of Studebaker's South Bend plant. They were rebadged Studebakers with Packard trim. Enthusiasts call them Packard bakers. 7,431 were sold in 2 years. The last one left South Bend on July 25, 1958. The Packard name was dropped in 1962. The plant on East Grand Boulevard stood for decades as one of Detroit's most recognized ruins. Demolition was completed in December 2024. A redevelopment plan collapsed in March 2026 when the new mayor terminated negotiations after a missed deadline. 2 buildings still stand on East Grand Boulevard. This past July, a 1956 Packard Caribbean hardtop, one of 263 ever built, sold at auction in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania for $32,000. The market still knows what a real Packard was. Before we close, if this story found you, if you have been carrying a memory of one of these cars without quite knowing what to do with it, there are more stories like this one. Subscribe, and we will keep telling them. Stand at 1580. East Grand Boulevard in Detroit. Close your eyes. Hear 30,000 workers across 3 shifts. Smell the hot lacquer and the fresh paint. Feel the rhythm of impact wrenches, 1 car every 10 minutes, shift after shift. In a building Albert Kahn designed to outlast the business inside it. The car that presidents rode in, the car that outsold Cadillac. Now open your eyes, 2 walls, and a deadline that came and went.